goshawk, I think.
Might I say, it's an honour for me to be in this position of sitting and hearing from you some of your stories and experiences with regard to the world of falconry. I know your name is synonymous with peregrine, so I'd like to hear more of how it all started, or even when did falconry first come onto your radar, into your awareness?
Okay. Well, it's like a lot of American falconers of my age. We kind of got started in a similar way by reading an article in the National Geographic magazine in 1937. That was when I was 9 years old. And it was written by the famous twins, Frank and John Craighead. And you probably heard their names. And they became very famous conservation biologists in the States, working on mostly on mammals, grizzly bears in particular. But in their early years, when they were growing up, they were falconers. And they were among the first guys to actually do it successfully, and they published this this article in 1937 in the National Geographic about their experiences, basically when they were teenagers, and they were like 21 or 22 when they published this paper, and so I read that, and that really, got me interested in the whole concept of, because I liked pets, and I kind of grew up from the very first. I was interested in animals and insects and anything that was alive. So I always had something around me to play with that was alive, and so that led me. Their article then led me to an earlier article in the National Geographic by the famous artist Louis Agassiz Fuertes, who was not a falconer but was interested in falconry and did an article, an earlier kind of historical article on falconry with a lot of paintings of the Middle Ages, medieval falconry scenes in it, and so those two things really got my interest piqued, and then I also went to the Encyclopedia Britannica and read their article. They had a fairly long article on falconry in there, and so I got the rudiments of it from those sources, and I never knew another falconer until I was I think 15 years old. So I was self-taught, and because of that I made a lot of mistakes. but the very next summer after reading that article by the Craighead twins, I usually spent my summers on my grandfather's farm. Now I'm from Texas originally, and he had a farm in West Texas, and I found a Cooper's hawk's nest by a dam that he had built, a watering tank for his stock, and there were some big trees growing around that, and in one of them was this stick nest. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I knew it was a hawk. So I climbed up there and took a nestling out of that nest and raised it up, and I kind of had a hard time finding food for it, so I ended up feeding it mostly catfish that I got out of his pond, and it worked fine. I mean, the bird developed perfectly and had good feather and everything. In the meantime, I finally discovered by doing some reading that it was a Cooper's hawk. So then we actually lived in Dallas, Texas at that time. So I took the bird up to my home in Dallas and built my dad helped me build a muse for it.
Right.
And raised it up in there. And but I didn't know enough. I didn't know that you had to, that they were, when they said that they needed to be starved, that it really meant they needed to be cut down, So I kept wondering why it wouldn't respond to me, because I was always filling it up with food, so it was fat all the time. And because of that, I never had any control over it. But it was, you know, it was a tame, a hand-reared bird, so I could turn it loose. And it would roam around out in the yard and out, you know, a little bit beyond there. But it liked the mews. And I mean, and that was where it was fed, and so it would always come back in there. It was almost like hacking, although, you know, I didn't even really know about hacking then. But finally, I kind of gave up on it after a while and just decided to let it go free. So I fed it up real good and turned it loose, and it gradually, in 2 or 3 days, it had, by that time it was flying really well. It took off and disappeared, and that was the end of that particular falconry experience. After that, I worked mostly with kestrels.
Right.
And a lot of those were birds that had been injured some way or other, and so that they were actually kind of being rehabilitated more than anything else. And some of those made it and some didn't. And so that was the way it kind of worked during my early boyhood experiences with falconry. And but I kept my interest up in it, reading as much as I could everywhere. And we then, when I was 15 years old, we left Dallas and moved to California, Southern California, in the Los Angeles area. And there were lots of, we lived at the outskirts of town. So there was a lot of natural area around our house. Although we were in the city limits, nevertheless we were kind of also a little bit in the country. And there were a lot of Cooper's hawks that nested in the canyons back of our place. And so again, I got interested in Cooper's hawks, and most of those were birds that I trapped, so they were like passage birds.
Right.
And again, I still hadn't caught on to the idea that I really had to lean them down to get them to behave. So I went through several of those, again, with kind of bad experiences, and ended up usually, you know, letting, either they escaped or else I let them loose. And it wasn't really until then, about that time also, was when I met the first falconer, real falconer. And he was a real falconer because he was a Hungarian.
Right.
And he came from a family that had a long tradition of falconry. And so he's taught me, you know, some of the things that I should have known earlier. And he knew where there was a peregrine nest. And so he made a deal with me. I'm trying to remember, for some reason or other, his job prevented him from having a lot of free time. And so he kind of talked me into trying to get a bird for him. And so he said, I'll tell you where this peregrine nest is if we make an agreement. If there are 2 or more birds in the nest, I get first choice of a bird. If there's only one available, then you can have it. So that sounded like a good deal to me. So a friend of mine, a boyfriend of mine, who was also interested in birds, and I went out to this eyrie, which was at a place called Chatsworth Lake. It was actually an artificial. It was a dammed body of water, and we got to this cliff, and we saw the birds were flying around and they were screaming at the adults. We climbed up, and I didn't know anything about cliff climbing either. So he had given me a rope, and so sort of told me the basic things to do to be careful and so on. And so we threw the rope down, and the hawks were going crazy, and the falcons, they were really diving and screaming at us. And so we knew we were really there, okay? And so I didn't know how to rappel or anything. I just used the rope and walked my hands down on the rope It wasn't a real steep climb, and it wasn't very far down from the top. It was only maybe 50 feet below the top.
Nevertheless.
Anyway, I got down on this ledge, and there were all these remains of dead birds that were obvious things that they'd brought into the nest for food. And so I figured I was landed in the right place, and was looking around, and I couldn't find any birds. No baby birds anywhere, and but the hawks were still going crazy, and they were stooping right down in on me. The female in particular was passing right by me, and I couldn't figure out what the deal was. There had to be birds there somewhere, but we never found any, and so we finally gave up and got back down to the bottom of the cliff, and there was a kind of a hermit guy living in a shack, and more or less at the base of the cliff, and he was at home. So we stopped to say hello to him, and so we explained what we had been doing, and we wondered why the birds were so angry at us, and we couldn't find any young. And he said, "Oh, somebody had come last week and taken them all."
Oh God.
So that was the end of that experience. But anyway, that was kind of how it got started, and eventually I didn't really get into real falconry until I was in college. And after I did a period of time in the service, 18 months, just after the war had ended. And when I got back from that, I started school, in college level, and I got back into the falconry again at that time. And also I was I was actually doing kind of ornithological studies as well. I mean, I was interested in birds in general, not just in falcons, but falcons were my main interest. And I had just to go back actually a year or so, when I was in high school, last year of high school was the height of the war, and there were practically no young men left anywhere, so outfits were looking for people to hire, and so you had to dip into high school kids to find people to do the work that normally adults would be doing. And I got involved with the LA County Museum of Natural History, and they were doing coursework. And they were doing weekend courses for high school students, selected high school students who had a particular interest in biology or natural history. And there was an old curator there named George Willett, and he was the bird and mammal curator at the museum, and he had been an egg collector, and all egg collectors prize hawk eggs, above nearly all else, particularly falcons. So he had collected a lot of peregrine eggs over the years, and showed me his collection. But he wouldn't tell me where the nests. He didn't want to tell me where the nests were, which is typical again. Mm-hmm. But he said, "Tom, if you really want to find peregrines, you should go to Alaska." He had worked in Alaska in his earlier years, and had been a law enforcement officer up there, among other things. And he had collected eggs, peregrine eggs up there, and he said, "I can tell you, and I'll tell you one place where you can find them." And he told me about this place called Forester Island, and he said there are 10 pairs of peregrines nesting on that island. I visited it several times, and if you go there, you'll find them. These were Peel's peregrines. These were on the coast of Alaska, and so I had kept that in my back of my mind. And when I got out of the service, I decided to use my GI Bill of Rights, which I had then. The government program to provide educational opportunities for people that had been in the service. Use that money to go to the University of Alaska, and not because I necessarily wanted to go to the University of Alaska, but because I wanted to go to Alaska. Okay, so that got me up to Alaska, and I never did get out to Forester Island, but I started looking around in interior Alaska, where the university was at Fairbanks, Alaska, and so the summer that I graduated from there in 1951, I took a canoe trip down the Yukon River, and middle section of the Yukon River in interior Alaska. Was I'd read an article in a reconnaissance of birds that had been done back in the late 1800s. During the gold rush period, 1899 and 1900, that period of time. And these two guys had said that they saw a pair of peregrines. There were a lot of cliffs on the river there, and they said that they saw a pair of peregrines about every 10 miles. That was. They didn't really count them, but they estimated that that's what they saw, and that really intrigued me. This has got to be the place where there are peregrines. So I took this canoe trip all by myself. I had one of my instructors that took me up there and turned me out with with this collapsible canoe, which I had to put together. And I made this trip down the river, and they were right. There were peregrines all along the river, and I think I ended up with about 20 pairs, as I recall, that I visited on that trip. And I took 2 birds there and brought them back to a famous falconer in Idaho named Morley Nelson, and gave them to him to train, and he then in turn showed me all the ropes about how to do it, and I spent quite a bit of time with him off and on over the next several years, and he taught me how to rope climb, how to rappel and that sort of stuff. So from that time on, I was really pretty into what needed to be done, and he told me about how you have to reduce them by 15% of their starting weight and so on and that sort of thing to get them to respond. So I learned how to do it then, and I had birds from that time on that I trained and flew all through the rest of my period in graduate school at the University of California in Los Angeles. And at that time also, I would have been in the 50s, early 50s, and I got my PhD degree in 57, I think it was. And I wrote my thesis was on the birds that I had seen in Alaska, on the Yukon River, and also on some other rivers. I did a number of river travels while I was in graduate school. And so I thought I was going to say something else, and I lost my train of thought here now. Where was I? About... yeah. Well, while I was doing the graduate work, I also joined a local falconry club called the Southern California Falconers Association. It was mostly a bunch of high school kids, and they were a little bit rambunctious. And maybe there might have been a couple of other guys that were about my age. The guy who kind of started it and headed it up was in fact a grade school teacher, so we sort of didn't have birds that belonged to individuals, but they were kind of club birds,
right?
Okay. And we would share them around and learn what a goshawk will do and what a peregrine will do and so on. And so I that was when I first started really, being able to actually do it and go out hunting and actually catch something. from that time on, my first we had club peregrines. At that time, that was also when the peregrine was disappearing because of the pesticide problems.
Yeah.
And the nests that had been known in California to supply birds for falconers turned up empty again. Like the one that I had seen earlier, that one totally disappeared, and several others that had been known to local falconers were no longer producing birds. And that was the first kind of indication we had that something was not right, and that there was a serious problem going on. But there was one nest that remained productive right through the whole period of that time when everybody else was having troubles, and so we would get our peregrines from that nest, but unfortunately other people knew about the nest too, so it got heavily used, let's put it that way, during that period of time. So, what else would you like to know?
So when you were in this club, I mean, what I'm finding impressive, inspirational, is that really, you pioneered yourself through not having any contact with other falconers and really not knowing, or learning yourself. These days, of course, we have the internet, there's so many falconry courses, and there you were, sort of very isolated.
Yeah, the information either was from books or from actual people who did it.
Yes.
The book that, of course, that was most influential was the translation, the K.C.A. Wood's translation of Emperor Frederick II's book on falconry, which came out in 1943. That was just at the time I moved to California. And I found out about that book through a contact at the Smithsonian Institution. But that was when I was having all those problems with the Cooper's hawks.
Right.
And so I decided to write to somebody and see if I could find out something about what I was doing wrong. So I thought the Smithsonian Institution, which is a major, a museum, national museum actually, in our country, would have somebody there that could tell me. So I just wrote a letter there when I was 15 years old, and I got a reply back.
Yeah.